Yeah, right.
We're not recording, right?
Oh, I'm recording. So, yeah, okay.
Fair enough. Well, welcome everybody back to the second day of Glasgow Economic Forum. Thank you to everybody who showed up yesterday, and I hope today is going to be just as good and smooth as it went Saturday. So just to give you a few logistic details before we start, the whole schedule for the day, if you want to check out what's going to be going on throughout the day, is on our Facebook page of Glasgow Economic Forum. And every talk is going to be taking roughly the format of about 45 minutes of talk and then a few minutes of Q&A that will be moderated by someone from Jeff. We encourage you to put your questions into the Q&A chat throughout the talk so that you have the ability to upvote questions that you think are more worth asking, because it's possible not all questions will get asked, but put as much as you can in there so we have interesting stuff to engage with. Thanks.
Well, good morning, everybody. Thank you again for joining us on a Sunday morning. My name is Doncho, for those of you that weren't here yesterday, and I'm incredibly pleased to introduce Professor Steve Keen, who is joining us live all the way from Thailand, and we're very grateful to have him with us. Professor Keen is a distinguished research fellow at UCL for the Institute for Strategy, Resilience and Security. He is also the author of Debunking Economics and Can We Avoid Another Financial Crisis, and one of the few economists to anticipate the global financial crisis of 2008, for which he received the Revere Award and the Real World Economics from the Real World Economics Review. And he is now crowdfunded at patreon.com/Prof. Steve Keen. His main research interests are developing the complex systems approach to macroeconomics and the economics of climate change. And today he will be speaking about the inherent instability of capitalism. And once again, thank you so much for joining us from such a far distance, and please give him your warmest welcome in whatever way you can. Thank you.
Long distance applause. Okay, thank you. All right, I'll go sharing my screen here. And I'll be covering a few topics today, starting with how one models in economics, but getting onto the issue of climate change as well, which of course is the defining topic of our time. And the point of view I take is that capitalism's crisis is self-generated. The whole idea that they're due to exogenous shocks is normally nonsense. We're experiencing one now. It's probably the first time in history, apart from world wars, where we actually have had something you can vaguely regard as exogenous as actually causing a crisis. And I want to start with why do economists talk so much about equilibrium anyway? Because if you go back and look at where modern economics originated, this is where the Neoclassical school began with Jevons, Volras, Menger and Marshall back in the late 19th and early 20th century. And Jevons was quite frank in saying we should be using dynamics. We should be looking at non-equilibrium processes, because the whole idea that capitalism occurs in an equilibrium state is a travesty, a description of this social system. And in writing at the end of the 19th is a sort of what's going to happen in 20th century economics, J.B. Clark, who's the one who gave us the marginal productivity theory of income distribution, one of many errors in mainstream economics, but nonetheless he was a major contributor. He thought the 20th century was going to be marked by dynamics. And I know that a lot of economists might think, well, we've got dynamic, stochastic, general equilibrium models now. What are you complaining about? I'm using the basis of how a mathematician will describe dynamics, and a beautiful book written about 30 years ago, and now reissued. I highly recommend anybody who wants to learn about non-equilibrium thinking in economics to get a copy of John Blatt's Dynamic Economic Systems. He said, capitalism may well cease existing as a social system before its dynamics are understood by economists. Now, I'm waiting for some scoffs from neoclassical models because they have this sort of belief. This is from V.V. Chary, when he went before the Congress to explain why economists didn't see the financial crisis coming. He basically said, if you have a story to tell, you can tell it using DSGE. If you can't, your story is incoherent. Now, to reply to that, in 2016, when Roemer was the worthier recipient of a Nobel Prize of the two that were given it in 2018. In 2016, he said macro's gone backwards for more than 3 decades, which takes it right back to the time Blatt is talking about. We're not talking even postmodern economics, we're talking post-real economics, in his opinion. I completely agree with that. So equilibrium has gone from being a modeling crutch, to use until we can do dynamics to a fetish, a false god. And ironically, the reason it's been successful is because it's failed. And I love the way that Yanis Varoufakis put this in a paper with the Asperger back in 2006. So many failures have occurred that in trying to evade the impact of the failures, the level of diversion and alternative ideas and so on has become so overwhelming, it's become a belief system that has got in the way of any real change in economics. So, for example, if you look at the very first attempt to do equilibrium modelling in a mathematical sense in economics, it was Leon Walras's Tatonement model of how a vector of equilibrium prices could be generated by a process of groping from a random set of initial prices to a set of prices that gave you equilibrium in every market. And he believed it would work. He didn't have the mathematics to prove it. He actually approached the world's leading mathematician at the time, Henri Poincaré, to ask for his agreement. Poincaré refused to say that the algorithm that Walras had dreamt up would work to reach an equilibrium set of prices. And in the early 1910s, 1920s, a totally independent proof by mathematicians of the nature of matrices consisting of non-negative numbers proved that Thomas process wouldn't work. Now, when economists finally became aware of that mathematical disproof, this is the sort of way they reacted. So Jorgen has said, we can evade this outcome if we have suitable restrictions on the initial values of the disequilibrium variables. Well, great. If we start in nirvana, we can stay there forever. It's just a great idea. Let's start the world in the Garden of Eden. Nothing can possibly go wrong. But that's pretty much the thinking. If we start in the Garden of Eden, we'll remain there. No apples will turn up. Look now at the Ramsey growth models, which were something developed in the 1920s by a mathematical prodigy and then used as the basis for a trade cycle modeling now. That model is unstable. The equilibrium, long-term equilibrium, is unstable. So Ramsey's solution is that a social planner could change consumption now to put you on the stable vector towards the unstable equilibrium over time. And that's been taken by real business cycle modelers and then DSGE models to imagine the existence of agents who are so omniscient they can work out how to jump onto a horse's saddle from a large distance and not slide off the other side, which is fundamentally what's going on with their algorithms. So rather than accepting that these things are non-equilibrium processes, neoclassical economists have added what they call simplifying assumptions, which are actually fantasies, to fudge the continued existence of equilibrium. And when you look at what mathematicians themselves were doing, it's a very, very different approach. So you go back to the 1920s, you find mathematical biologists as well, trying to work out why there were cycles. As it happens here, it was in the records of fish versus shark catchers in Italian fishing during the First World War. And what he saw this process of, you start with a small number of cows. He actually example said it was cows and grass in his paper. So the cows can't eat all the grass grows. That gives you more cows, the grass shrinks, cows die, back to the same cycle again. Now, he believed that would actually converge to equilibrium. But what he said, he's surprised to find that it didn't. You got undamped and hence indefinitely continued oscillations. And that was the beginning of predator-prey modeling. And I can come back and model that if anybody wants to take a look at that in my Minsky software. But that is a process which gives you continued repeated cycles. The equilibrium, which is this red dot here, the system neither approaches nor diverges from it. So you get permanent cycles around the equilibrium. The equilibrium is not where everything happens. Now, instead, economics went with Frisch's argument that we can explain cycles as the result, the reactions of a stable system to unstable shocks from the outside. And his analogy was a rocking horse. If you hit a rocking horse with a club, the movement of the horse will be very different to the movement of the club. So this is the exogenous shock explanation, which became the basis of how economists ever since, mainstream economists, have modeled cycles and volatility in capitalism. It's all due to exogenous shocks. Now, in the real world, and this is what Lochter's work was showing to us, the source of energy that maintains cycles, to quote Frisch above, is nonlinear feedback. you have forces which that simple model of predator and prey showed cancel each other out in terms of convergence to equilibrium, so they're maintained permanently. But many economists, the very few actually economists who are aware of work like that, would dismiss it on the basis, well, the cycles aren't regular, they're not sine waves, we can't use them. But this was blown away in 1963 by Lorentz's work in meteorology, where he was dissatisfied with the linear models that were used by meteorologists back then to try to forecast the weather. He said, well, the main impact is nonlinear. So he took an extremely complicated set of equations, the Navier-Stokes equations for fluid flow, simplified it down to 3D model, and generated the model you see on screen now, where the, I wonder why, I'm not actually getting to click on that lens. I meant to do the simulation, that I'll come back and show that later if anybody's curious. What you got out of this was a simple model with 3 constants and 3 variables, which cycled indefinitely. There are 3 equilibria, one there, and one down here, all of which are unstable. One's actually there, that's, yeah, just about there. So there are 3 unstable equilibria in this model, but the system doesn't break down. It's because the forces close to the equilibrium are very different to those further away. So rather than getting breakdown, you get permanent cycles. And this was an artifact. The fact that you didn't see that in Lochter's work was just an artifact that he had only 2 species in his model. Once you have 3 or more dimensions, you get this sort of potential behavior. So chaotic behavior comes out of 3-dimensional or more interactions in a complex system. And what you're seeing is, from Lorentz's work as well as from Lochter's work, you build a model of the structure of the economy, of the system. You put in the simplest definitions you can use, and out of that you get dynamics which are determined by the structure of the model rather than by any assumptions you make about the entities that constitute the model. So I'm going to show that can be done in economics very, very simply. And I'm going to take start with 2 simple definitions. The wages share of GDP, which is simply defined as total wages divided by total GDP. Now, in dynamic terms, you can convert that into a differential equation by saying 1 over the rate of change of wages share times the rate of change of wages share, 1 over wages share times the rate of change, which is the percentage rate of change, will equal the percentage rate of wages minus the percentage rate of change of GDP. That's just the expanding and the definition into a dynamic form. The same thing for employment. So employment, employment ratio will rise if employment grows faster than population. Those are straight, simple, factual statements. Then what I do to turn this into a model is assume, for a start, a constant rate of population growth. So the rate of growth of population is beta% per annum. Then have a constant, a common wage across different sectors of the economy. Again, a simplification. And that means the rate of change of the wages bill is the rate of change of wages plus the rate of change of the employment level, amount of employment, both in percentage terms. If you then bring in a simple linear, and Phillips emphasized you should have a non-linear Phillips curve, but a simple relationship between the level of employment and the rate of change of money, of real wages, and define a labor to output ratio, and again assume that grows at a constant rate over time, or output grows at alpha% per annum faster than labor does, and define a capital output ratio, which again is a fairly common definition in economics, and for the sake of simplicity, assume that it's a constant. You do all that and add the assumption that all profits are invested, which is the most favorable use one can imagine for profits. What you get is this model, which is saying the rate of change of the employment rate is the employment rate multiplied by the growth rate minus the sum of labour productivity and population growth. And the rate of growth of wages share is wages share multiplied by the function for wage change, which is a function of the rate of employment. Now that model put together, what you get is cyclical growth. Exactly the same basic characteristics as the predator-prey model that I showed earlier. And in fact, Marx, if he'd actually managed to master calculus, may well have done this 50 years before the mathematicians did, because this model was first written up in verbal terms in chapter 25 of volume 1 of Capital in 1867. But this was the insight that Goodwin had. You can actually show this cyclical nature of capitalism as an extension of predator-prey dynamics. Now, my work in economics, began in critiquing Marx, but the first contribution in terms of modeling was to show that you could add the role of debt in a capitalist economy. This is private debt. And I've now did that with my paper back in '95 on finance and economic breakdown modeling, Minsky's financial instability hypothesis. I've since realized I can build that simply by adding in a third definition, the ratio of private debt to GDP. And I'll do the same story and differentiate that with respect to GDP. I've done the first two already. The third one says private debt, the ratio of private debt to GDP will grow if private debt grows faster than the economy grows. Again, an obvious factual statement. Now, if I had the simplifying assumption that debt is used to finance investment, which again is the most positive use one can think of for borrowed money, rather than speculating this is actually building factories, and in fact there's empirical support for this as a generalization from Fama and French, and then say use a similar function for the investment rate that I used for wage determination earlier, just a linear relationship between the rate of profit and the level of investment is in GDP, what you get is Minsky's financial instability hypothesis. So those equations simply add a third dimension, and that's why it's important in terms of mathematical modeling, to the one I showed you beforehand. And when you simulate that model, what you get is this sort of behavior. And I hope I've set this up properly to load. Let's see. Yep, I have. Okay, this is running the software, the program in Minsky. And if I simulate this with an aggressive response to the rate of profit by investment by capitalists, then what you get is a system which appears to be converging towards equilibrium. You look at the growth rate here, it's the cycles in growth rate are getting smaller, where the distribution of income is going in favor of bankers over capitalists, over workers. Capitalists are getting much the same level. Workers' share of GDP is falling as the share going to bankers is rising. And then after a while, those diminishing cycles become increasing cycles. Okay. Now, none of that makes any sense from a neoclassical point of view, but it's what happened in the economy. If you take a look at it in a stylized sense, in the same way that Lorentz's models are stylized about what happens inside a hurricane, this is stylized of what's happening inside capitalism. So you get a period of rising and then falling and then rising cycles, a rising debt ratio over time, and a falling amount going to workers. So the distribution of income going in favor of the rich, and then finally a breakdown. Now, I wrote that model before we saw what the economists called the Great Moderation. So I actually wrote it back I finished writing in August of 1992. So that's the date in which I published. I didn't publish the paper, but I first wrote the mathematical model. And what you saw happening up until that, what became apparent after then, was this drop in the peak level of unemployment continued. So there was declining volatility in economic data over time. There was a falling wages share turning up in data over time, and there was a rising private debt ratio. Now, economists just focused on the first and thought, wow, aren't we fantastic, until the crisis hit. So if you look at, and I'll just actually minimize the number of windows that I see there, so I see less people getting in the way of the text for me here. What you get out of my model is a capacity to interpret both the Great Moderation and the Great Recession as part of the same process. Whereas the mainstream, first of all, took credit for what they call the Great Moderation, talking about a marked reduction in volatility. And this is a welcome change in the economy. This has Ben Bernanke in 2004. Then the crisis hit. And after the crisis, what does he go and say? Well, not that our economics got it wrong. It's just that our engineering didn't work, but our science is still correct. Well, I think that's a great way of trying to get around the problem, Ben, but it's not reality. You're obfuscating the fact that, look, your theory's got it wrong. It wasn't stable, it was unstable. Now, you can add more realism to this model quite simply by doing things like, as I've done here, bringing in price dynamics. That gives you another definitional change, which then gives you a change in the overall dynamics, again, making it closer to what we've actually seen over time, rising and falling cycles, a period of apparent stability, and then a collapse coming out of that. So this is the structural approach to building models is the way that we should do it. Okay? We can build far better models of the economy by starting with the structure and working in genuine dynamic terms. And the fact that the mainstream does everything by talking about this incredible capacity called rational expectations, which is actually, if you read out the definition of rational expectations to somebody doing a major in English, they would tell you that's, and you ask them what word in the dictionary you were defining, their first guess would be capacity for accurate prophecy. Okay, that's what rational expectation, prophetic behavior is what's being assumed. Well, if you can do prophecy, you don't need a market. You don't need capitalism at all. So it's far from a defense of capitalism, it's a total obfuscation of its nature. And this comes out of a history of ignoring money. So if you go back to Smith, and Smith is not a neoclassical economist, of course, but many of the mistakes that Smith made were ones that the neoclassicals stuck with. One is the argument that we're a barter system. And David Graeber, unfortunately long dear departed David, has said, well, nobody ever saw a dog make an exchange of a bone with another dog, but no anthropologist has found a society that does barter either. This is the vision that David has said is the common vision that economists have, a natural propensity to truck and barter. Money is simply the most efficient means. But he says, when you go looking for it as anthropologists, they found no evidence of it happening whatsoever. They couldn't find a society which internally used barter. They could find some instances of barter trade between rival and close to warring tribes on their boundaries, but no societies that functioned with barter. So they're wrong about everything. Neoclassicals are wrong about everything, including the role of money. So if you take a look at Lucas, for example, this is the paper that gave us the so-called Lucas critique. And he is, again, in that paper, though he got away with focusing it predominantly or having it interpreted as being a critique of bad econometrics, he was actually going against the whole idea of a disequilibrium reproach and still sees money illusion as being a realistic description of an error in society. And neoclassicals today still believe we should model the economy without debt or banks. This is a British economist, Tony Yates, and he wrote this, put this tweet out quite recently. I thought it was just priceless. Most people who teach macro do it by letting people through simple models without money. And then he says, you can even do banks without money, and it's better to start there and then add them on later. This is the fact that you don't think, hang on, we did this and didn't see the financial crisis coming. Isn't there something wrong with this? No, no, no. They're doubling down on doing it later. And equally, before the crisis, Bernanke rejected Fisher's debt deflation theory, saying, well, that can't, pure redistributions can't have any real effect on the macroeconomy. Now, I have been publishing this data for, I think, about 15 years now. I'm pretty much getting sick of publishing it and getting no response from certainly mainstream economists. I'd like some non-orthodox ones to have a go at this. But this is the relationship between change in private debt, which is credit, and unemployment in 1920 to 1940. And at the time that Bernanke says no significant macroeconomic effects, whatever the causation should be, the argument that there should be no significant effects is effectively a hypothesis that that relationship should be not significantly different from zero. Well, it's barely significantly different from -1. And when you take a look at the most recent data from 90 to 2010, it's minus 0.93. Yeah. It's outrageously obvious that there's something in the data that needs to be investigated and which is still being ignored by neoclassicals. So I want to show why that's coming about. Why does credit have a role in aggregate income? And this is something which non-orthodox economists struggled with as well. I was involved with many debates with Mark Lavoie and many others trying to refine this, because I was arguing credit added to aggregate demand, but that appeared to violate the principle that income is identical to expenditure at the aggregate level. So I've found a way to do that with using what I call a Moore table after Basil Moore. So if you divide the economy into X sectors, where X is, I'm using 3 here, but it can be any number of sectors, so long as they're mutually exclusive. And then show expenditure on the horizontal. So each row shows spending by one sector, which is a negative, on the other sectors, which are all positives, where the negative and positives must all sum to 0. And then the net income is what happens on the vertical axis. Then if you look at the table, the negative of the diagonal is aggregate expenditure. The sum of the off diagonal is aggregate income, and they are necessarily equal to each other. The sum of the overall thing must be the same. The aggregate sum must be 0. So look at the first situation where there's no lending or banking, and imagine we've divided the economy into households, services, where I'm not including banks, by the way, just retail services, social, health, etc., etc., and then manufacturing. So households spend $8 per year on services and B dollars per year on manufacturing. Service sector spends C dollars per year on households and D on manufacturing, etc., etc. And when you sum up the negative of the diagonal, that's aggregate expenditure. The positive of the sum of the off diagonal is aggregate income, and they're necessarily equal to each other. That's the starting point. Well, let's now consider the myth that neoclassical economists like pretending about, which is that banks don't actually lend money and don't create money. They are simply intermediaries between savers, that classic word you'll find in the neoclassical macro text of them being intermediaries. So what I have here is one non-bank, which is this is going to be the services sector, lending credit dollars per year to another non-bank, which would be the household sector, and see how that looks in the table. Well, because the services sector is sending credit dollars per year across to the household sector, then its expenditure on one of the other sectors has to be less by that same amount. Okay? D minus credit. So their manufacturing, I could apportion it any way I like, but this is just for simplicity. The overall effect is exactly the same. So to lend credit dollars per year to households, services spends credit dollars per year less on manufacturing. And when you do your sum, both on the income side, expenditure side and the income side, you find that credit cancels out. Okay? Interest payments turn up as part of aggregate expenditure and aggregate income, but credit is not there. So that's the vision neoclassicals have of banking. And if that was what banks actually did, they'd be right. Credit would play no role in aggregate demand. But the real world is where banks create money. And banks lend to what I'm doing here is having banks lending credit dollars per year to households, and households then using that money to buy from manufacturing. Again, just making a simple case rather than all the different flows that are possible. So we have credit dollars per year being added to the debt of the household sector, credit dollars per year spending up in the household's capacity to spend, and that credit dollars per year being spent on the manufacturing sector, and the households then paying interest dollars per year to the banks to pay for that. You do your sums here and you find credit doesn't cancel out. Credit turns up once in expenditure and once in income, and therefore credit is part of aggregate expenditure and aggregate income. That's why it matters. That's what's being ignored by neoclassicals by sticking to the loanable funds model. So credit doesn't cancel out, and because credit is so volatile and can turn negative, whereas the other flows can only reduce, they can't turn negative, it's the determining factor in economic fluctuations. So loanable funds, which I can model again in Minsky, and this is a Minsky model I've done of the loanable fund sector where capitalists lend to firms and get paid dividends and interest payments back as well. And when you model that, when I simulate it, I find that the relationship between, there is some effect of lending on aggregate income, but a rising level of debt is associated with a falling level of income. Now, when you do it, when you change it around and say, well, in fact, the banks are the ones doing the lending, and it takes me about 30 seconds to make that change in Minsky, then what I find is there's a positive relationship. Rising debt gives you rising income through the credit channel, and falling debt gives you negative income also through the credit channel. So the relationship is entirely different. That's how big a mistake it is to think about the economy in a neoclassical way. You're missing the major determinant of cycles, you're missing cycles being endogenous, and you're missing the role of the banking sector, which is a critical part of a capitalist economy. So that's why we should get rid of neoclassical economics in macroeconomics. I now want to talk about we should get rid of neoclassical economics completely, because we are going to face an ecological crisis, and a lot of that will be blamed on the Exxons of the world and so on, but a large part of it is due to neoclassical economists as well. And it's not just neoclassical economists, I've got to be more general here, because no school of economic thought has properly incorporated the role of energy in a capitalist economy. They've left, or in economy at all, they've left out the role of energy in production. And there's a wonderful quote, one of my favorite quotes of all time, from a 1920s equivalent of Stephen Hawking's in that sense, a physicist who was also a popular writer. And he said that the laws of thermodynamics are the supreme laws in nature. If you have a theory of the universe which is inconsistent with Maxwell, then so much the worse for Maxwell, and that's of course what Planck's work did. If you contradict observation, well, sometimes experiments get wrong. But if you contradict the second law of thermodynamics, I can give you no hope. There is nothing for your theory but to collapse in deepest humiliation. Now, frankly, that applies to all of economics. We haven't had a model a mathematical model of production that includes the role of energy. And that's what I've now managed to do by a simple insight, that if we have models of production in both post-Keynesian and neoclassical economics, where we have output being produced by labor and capital. But labor without energy is a corpse, and capital without energy is a sculpture. Energy motivates both those factors of production, so-called. So you've got to have energy inputs to actually be able to explain what's going on. So the conventional neoclassical model is to say that output is total factor productivity multiplied by capital raised to alpha times labor raised to 1 minus alpha, where the alpha reflects income shares in the economy. And the post-Keynesians tend to use the Leontief production function, which at its simplest is simply saying output is capacity utilization multiplied by capital stock divided by a capital output ratio. Now, what I do is replace K and L with K and L as both functions of energy, different forms of energy and input to both, of course. So for L, I make L is an argument of E times labor times the energy consumption per worker times the fraction of that energy consumption that's turned into useful work in terms of producing GDP rather than relaxing. And for machinery, the number of machines, which is a problematic thing to define in the first place, times the energy consumption per machine times the efficiency with which that's turned into useful work. And when you do it, what you get for the Cobb-Douglas production function is a change so that this thing replaces total factor productivity, and that what it turns out to be is effectively the energy consumption level of the representative machine at some time in history. So back at the time of James Watts, that was about 10 tons of coal per day, and at the time of Elon Musk, it's about 10 tons of methane per second. And that energy change is the main reason we've seen a rise in what we call GDP. Now, for the Leontief expression, it actually fits the data much, much better. When you look at the energy and GDP relationship, a straight line fit is far better than anything involving flexible factor proportions. And it's possible then to take that and build models of the economy starting from the role of energy. And because what turns out of this is that it's possible to show, and I'm doing this fairly rapidly, so I'll pardon me for doing too quickly, but I'll share the presentation with the conference organisers and on my Patreon page, so anybody who wants to check it out in more detail can do it. This is defining output, taking, first of all, having energy in terms of output in terms of energy alone, and then looking at the normal equation we use. These two terms are the same. These two terms are the same. This is the same dimension. One's a scalar, the other's a scalar. I then do a transformation and say, well, what can I equate over here? So I equate terms with the same dimensions. So EY, which is a conversion between the energy content of a unit of GDP, you equate that, and you find that what we call the capital output ratio here is actually the efficiency with which machines turn energy into useful work. So that's a realistic way of interpreting what we used to call capital output ratio. And what it lets you do is derive a model which includes the role of energy, and it comes out of being the same as the basic Goodwin model, but it includes now a depletion of energy resources, creation of waste energy, and so on. So it's got the same dynamics of the basic Goodwin model, but you can now link that to resource use, pollution, and effects on productive capacity via that efficiency of conversion of energy into useful work. And this is, again, one model showing it developing. Again, for the sake of time, I won't go and talk through it, but I'm happy to come back and discuss this and also simulate this model. I'll just actually get it running here in the meantime. Again, this is running in my Minsky software. So all this is doable. We don't have to stick with an unrealistic model of economics. Okay? Realism is what we should be striving for rather than avoiding, which is what neoclassical economists have done to us for the last century. So the question is, why does economics continue doing this? Why don't we get change in economics like we get in sciences. And you might know the classic statement by Planck, which has been carried by Planck trying to explain why he couldn't convince his fellow physicists of the quantum interpretation of reality. He finally said, paraphrasing it, science advances one funeral at a time. So what he actually said was any new scientific truth does not triumph by convincing its opponents and making them see the light, but rather because its opponents eventually die and a new generation grows up that is familiar with it. That's what works in a real science. Well, let's look at it in terms of the Ptolemy and Earth-centric view of astronomy that Ptolemy's astronomers had. And give it its due, that mathematical model, even though it's fundamentally wrong, lets you predict the future motion of the planets to a reasonable degree of accuracy, given the mathematics at the time. Now, you've got many, many errors coming out of it, but the simplest example of why this failed was take the idea of comets. The founding idea of the Aristotelian vision was that the heavens are perfect and Earth is where decay happens. So Aristotle's explanation for comets were they were atmospheric phenomena, which we can laugh at these days, but nobody knew how far the atmosphere extended, what it actually was back in Aristotle's day. And then, of course, Halley's Comet comes back when Halley predicted it, meaning it's predictable. So that confirms the Copernican Newtonian vision of the world. But that didn't convert Ptolemaic astronomers into being Copernican ones. They went through a scientific revolution instead. So let's look at one example of that again, the idea that there had to be this substance called the ether to explain why light travels through the vacuum of space. And Michelson and Morley found there was no such ether. Now, along comes Planck and gives the relativity and quantum explanation for how light can travel through a vacuum. That didn't stop Maxwellian physicists continuing to teach Maxwellian equations. But the students knew of the anomaly. They could even confirm it themselves. The anomaly didn't disappear. It was easy to reproduce that experiment and show that there was no ether. So the students will only accept a theory that explains this huge anomaly. They want a paradigm shift. Now, the lecturers continue teaching the same old stuff, but ultimately they retire and die. The students have learned a new paradigm and they're committed to that new paradigm. The scientists have no choice but to replace themselves with the young kids when they come through, and so science advances one funeral at a time. And it's a punctuated process. You can look at it like this. You have an established paradigm, an anomaly is found, resisted by the establishment. The students can't be persuaded to ignore the anomaly. A new paradigm is developed that explains it. The old scientists die, students take their place, and you get a change in paradigm. That's what happens in genuine sciences. But in economics, you can ignore these past refutations of the paradigm. The anomaly, if it's an empirical one like the Great Depression or the Great Recession, happens once, can't be repeated, and you can't test alternative theories against it. New events come along like World War II for the Great Recession, COVID now for us, for looking at the Great Recession. That takes over the importance in the intermediate discussion. People forget about it. And you also have theoretical failures, which are glossed over. So, for example, the capital controversies back in the 60s, which were a fundamental critique of neoclassical theory, in which Samuelson conceded defeat, by the way. Okay, and this is the punchline, his final statements. If all this caused headaches for those nostalgic for the old-time parables of neoclassical writing, we must remind ourselves that scholars are not born to live an easy existence. We must respect and appraise the facts of life, which they did not do. And that includes Samuelson. So neoclassical texts continued reproducing the same nonsense about marginal productivity theory as if it hadn't been challenged. And now modern neoclassicals don't even know they lost that debate. They think they won it. And of course, the existing adherents, people like the Tony Yateses of the world and so on, they want to ignore the anomaly. They want to forget it. Now, of course, some students refuse to forget the anomaly, and that's where you get people like Hyman Minsky and ultimately me coming along and making these comments and saying we need an alternative model that can generate the phenomena we actually see. So you get rival paradigms, post-Keynesian, Austrian, Marxian, institutional, evolutionary, et cetera, they remain and they're marginalized and ignored. They never replace the neoclassicals, they never go away either. So what you get is economics remains in a pre-scientific state. The old paradigm can find believers among new students. And the reason for this is the neoclassical vision is very seductive. Just as the Ptolemaic vision was this idea of a perfect heavens and flawed earth, which is reaffirms a religious view of the world, the meritocratic worldview that neoclassicals have is effectively a utopian anarchist interpretation of capitalism. It works best without any power structure, and they let people do what they want to do, and that's a utopia. No wonder people fall for it. I did myself when I was 16. I grew up, unfortunately. So students who don't grow up get sucked in by this vision and become the new professors, and the old paradigm carries on and all the anomalies are ignored. Critics like myself end up in heterodox schools of thought. We're a minority in the discipline overall. We're definitely poorly funded, and we still exist. We live in low-rank universities like Kingston that can suffer destructive consequences from any change in government policy. And economics avoids its revolution. It's not a science. It won't be the science until a genuine paradigm shift occurs, and then we respect the need for those paradigm shifts in future. So we have what I call the neoclassical disease coming out as well instead. Rather than reforming the science and changing its whole basis, you make absurd assumptions to ignore the anomalies, the old let's assume a can opener type of behavior. So we can't afford this anymore, because in particular, the illness of the neoclassical disease and what it's let Nordhaus and his friends get away with in climate change means capitalism, I think, is going to face an existential crisis in the next 2 decades. I can't see any way that a genuine free market economy can survive what's going to happen with climate change. We've already seen it didn't survive in any totally undoctored sense what happened with COVID. Climate change is going to be an order of magnitude or two more destructive to market distribution systems. So let's get rid of the old paradigm, learn complex systems, learn system dynamics. There's much more work you've got to do in your own time. You probably, if you do it now, you won't get a lectureship in Oxford. You might become professor after the climate crisis strikes, but you won't get a job there at the moment. But you'll be part of the solution rather than part of the problem. So I urge any young students, if you're in the rethinking economics movement, stay there. If you're taking on the mainstream, continue doing it. Continue being a thorn in their side. You can get an interesting job outside economics. It's not necessary to be a professor. There are very few jobs there anyway, and being an academic is a shit job these days compared to what it was 30 years ago, so why aspire to it? And you can avoid the blame that's going to come the way of all economists when climate change exposes what a farce neoclassical economics has been in general. I'll finish with these couple of observations about the nonsense this led neoclassicals to be able to claim that climate change won't matter. He literally assumed 87% of GDP will be unaffected by climate change because it happens indoors. And idiots like Richard Toll, smart idiots like Richard Toll, use the fact that there's not much of an income distribution between places that are 10 degrees Celsius difference in temperature to say a 10-degree increase in in temperature won't have much of an impact upon the economy. I mean, that is just total nonsense. But that's the nonsense that neoclassical economics has led us to. It's time it went, and your generation has to be the one that gets rid of it. Thank you. I'll finish there and take questions. Just checking my time. Yep, good. Made it in 40 minutes. Okay, over to you, Doncho, if you've got any questions coming in.
Yeah, if you have any questions, you can put them in the Q&A, or if you are a panelist and you can't use the Q&A function, you can also use the chat. But I have a starting question actually. You mentioned obviously the importance of looking at all of these alternative models. And do you have any suggestions as to some foundational texts or some texts that can get people into this sort of thinking?
The one that I recommend most is one that I read back in the 80s myself, John Blatt, B-L-A-T-T, called Dynamic Economic Systems. It was out of print for a long time, and it's now just been re-released in Kindle form. If you go and take a look at it, you'll see the abstract talks about how it explains the importance of changes to property laws in Hong Kong. So somebody has completely stuffed up the Kindle record, but it's for John Blatt, B-L-A-T-T, in Dynamic Economic Systems. That'll be a great start. Then, of course, my debunking economics, but I think that's, put the point that way.
And we have a question from Pauline. She asks, you mentioned the collapse of capitalism in 2 decades. As it is unlikely something changes concretely by then, what do you see happening in this case?
Well, I actually recommend reading the new novel by Kim Stanley Robinson called The Ministry of the Future, because he actually chose the same factor that I thought would be the first factor to really point out just how drastic climate change is going to be versus the ludicrous garbage that comes out of neoclassical economists like Nordhaus and Toll. And that is what's called a wet bulb temperature catastrophe. Because what temperature is it for you in Glasgow right now? I had -1, -2?
No. I'm not in Glasgow at the moment, but I'm still in Scotland.
10 degrees.
Okay, well, it's 32. It's 32 degrees here in Bangkok, but we can. An essential part of being human is the capacity to disperse our body heat by evaporation, and that requires a combination of temperature and humidity, where what's called the wet bulb temperature is below 35 degrees. If it hits above 35, a naked person in the shade will die within 3 hours of heat exposure. And that's what Kim Stanley Robinson uses as the basis of the initial catastrophe in that book happening in India. Equally, it could be something as bizarre as we've seen with the Gulf Stream in the last couple of months, where the decline in the strength of the jet stream has meant that the polar vortex is bouncing all over the place, and you got literally sub-zero Celsius, in some cases sub-zero Fahrenheit temperatures in Texas. Now that starts hitting. It's going to be that's the sort of breakdown stuff that I think we potentially face. In that world, there's no way that a market fix is going to work. Just as Texas was hopeless, the market system didn't help at all. You got prices that meant people couldn't afford to avoid dying, and systems broke down anyway. It won't be a market-based economy. It'll be a command economy. And that's what I think we face as soon as we have a catastrophe which hits a major nation in a major way. And I think even though like we could see Gulf Stream effects with stuff with the AMOC, all sorts of crazy stuff is going to tip in the climate very, very soon. But the one I still think is most likely is something that affects India, because India is a big enough nation to be able to decide unilaterally, we're going to go in for geoengineering now, we're going to spray sulfur dioxide into the atmosphere. And if that drops the temperature of the planet by 4 degrees and you don't like it, that's your bad luck. You've done nothing about it. It's time we took direct action. So that's the sort of world that I think is coming our way. And in that world, you can forget about a market economy. We're in a war economy.
Okay. On this cheerful note, we'll take our next question, which is, okay, there's one that's gaining a lot of popularity here. How do you think the dominance of the US and the World Bank in the world economy have influenced the mainstream neoclassical thinking and the marginalized heterodox thinking?
Oh, very much. I mean, the American neoclassicals are, not to say that English neoclassicals were much better, but for example, John Hicks, who played a huge role in destroying Keynes, ultimately came around and admitted he'd done the wrong thing in 1980-81 in the paper ISLM and Explanation. So there's less rampant ideology in British and continental economics than there is in the mainstream in America, where there's sort of the capacity to binary thinking that seems to be an American trait. You're either for us or against us, that sort of thinking, means that they pushed a rabid version of neoclassical as the only vision one could have of capitalism, and drove out any rivals, and and that partisanship, which is so American in nature, I think is a major reason why neoclassical is as bad as it is. It was bad enough in the days of John Hicks. It's far worse now. And that American semi-religious element to their ideology, national ideology, I think is a substantial part of it.
And we have another question. What is the likelihood that any malicious actors will use these post-neoclassical economic models in order to push their own political agendas?
Oh, highly likely. I mean, that's what Hitler did. Hitler was a fan of Henry Ford, and Henry Ford understood endogenous money creation. And one of the first things Hitler did in power was to unleash the capacity of the state to finance the building of armaments and invasion of other countries. So yes, it's quite feasible. The thing is, are they doing less or more damage than the ones who are coming out with some spurious nonsense, like the mainstream on, on need to repay government debt, etc., etc. That's what gave rise to Hitler in the first place. Austerity economics imposed upon Germany in the aftermath of the Great Depression. So Hitler would have never become an issue if it hadn't been for austerity politics in the first place. And I think a similar thing applies to Donald Trump and to everything else we've seen since then. So bad. I don't want to say we should avoid good ideas because bad people might use them. The reality is far more important. Bad ideas cause good people to do bad things and leave us in a situation where truly bad people can take over.
And sorry, the question just, would you be able to comment on the US federal stimulus package and how its effects might propagate to the world outside of the US?
Oh, basically, it's the right idea with too little magnitude. They should have done a larger amount. Again, I wrote this back in February or March, I think. This is a classic case where the market economy can't function. And in that case, the state has to take over, providing money to people so they can meet their commitments. Pay your rent, pay your mortgage, and so on. Whereas with COVID meaning people can't go to work, then they can't meet their commitments, and you'll have a financial crisis caused by the medical crisis. So this was vital, and countries that have been successful, like Thailand, where I am at the moment, for example, has done a lot to support people's income so they can afford not to work and still stay alive during the lockdown. If America did more of this, it would be better off. So I'm glad it's been passed. It's good, but it's less than they should have done and slower. And of course, it's after they've lost 500,000 people to their net policies so far.
And okay, another question. You say that we should get rid of the old neoclassical paradigm. What paradigm should it be replaced with? And could you give us any founding postulates or hypotheses?
Well, the basic one I've given, the post-Keynesian school has been driven by the need for realism in economics. So in general, post-Keynesian economics is a better way to go. Ecological economics, there are elements that are good, elements that have been taken over by neoclassicals as well. But generally speaking, I'd say read post-Keynesian, read Schumpeter as well, read some of the ancient classicals, definitely read the physiocrats. But generally speaking, post-Keynesian economics, and then simply system dynamics. Like I showed you, it's impossible to dispute definitions. So I think you take three simple definitions, expand them with the simplest possible outcomes, and what do you get but a structural model of what actually happened in the last 40 years. So system dynamics is ultimately the way to go. And on that front, of course, neoclassical economists were the main enemies of system dynamics. Anything they don't like has to be good.
Okay. And I think we have about 3 more questions, which are all very interesting, so I'll be quick with them. Do the credit and energy model point towards a doomed economic future? Degrowth would lead us to debt deflation and financial instability, and the lack of it to climate crisis. What must policy do?
I think we've got to get ready for a massive degrowth and to put the burden of degrowth on the rich, not the poor. We've drastically overstretched the planet's capacity to support us as the peak predator, which is what we are. So we have to find a way to drastically reduce the pressure we put on the planet. And you can't do that by saying the poor have got to eat less. That'll just lead to social breakdown. So the policy that I'm supporting now is the idea of bringing in a parallel currency using central bank digital currency preferably, where we would have carbon rationing. Everybody would get a carbon ration, which could start as equivalent to the average for the country per head. Everybody gets the same average. And then when you buy something, you've got to pay both money and your carbon credit. The poor will never run out of the carbon credits, the rich will. So the rich will have to buy carbon credits off the poor. And that would put the pressure for adjustment on the wealthy rather than on the poor, and in fact give the poor a reason to support climate change, whereas at the moment the attitude of working class and unemployed people is harnessed by the right to oppose efforts on climate change because, hey, you'll get a carbon tax and you won't be able to buy petrol for your SUV anymore, or your sports, your off-road vehicle. So you want to make something where we harness the errors that of neoclassical economics have given us, the huge maldistribution of income, to be in favour of policies for change. But I think basically brace yourselves, because I think COVID's been a dry run of what climate change is going to be like, and it'll be worse than COVID.
And we have another question. Seeing how people like Nordhaus go on to win Nobel Prizes and teach at Yale, do you think that it is mere scientific or knowledge mistake on their part, or is there a political element behind their agenda and all of this? And do you see this changing from an academic / scientific revolution? So
these people genuinely believe their own garbage. Okay, I've spent 40 years working in and fighting against economics departments, and I can quite seriously say some of my best friends are neoclassical, maybe 2 or 3. So they genuinely believe this stuff. It's the way they view the world. And just like somebody who's burning you at the stake believes you're possessed by the devil and is doing it for your own benefit as well as society, they're doing it for the benefit of capitalism, burning it at the stake. So, the thing is, they can be harnessed by political groups. So they come up believing this stuff. And because they believe this stuff, they get funding from the Heritage Foundation and the major oil companies and so on. And they get, as well as giving themselves money because they're neoclassical and excluding people like myself, they also get outside money. So their voices get amplified, but they believe this in the first place. And it actually would be easier if they're just doing it for the money, because you could offer to pay them more and shut them up.
Okay. And one more question, which is from Mate, who's one of the organizers, so it's in the chat. In framing the neoclassical discussion as a pushback against neoclassical theory, you group together different heterodox schools who often have tensions and disagreements. And so you talk less about value-laden nature of economics. What is your view on the necessity to repoliticize or politicize economic modeling?
Well, it's fundamentally political, because it's about the distribution of income, wealth, and power. And pretending that it's not is just a total myth. So like all my models are based in terms of workers, capitalists, and bankers as my fundamental social classes. And if I went any further, which I don't think is particularly necessary, I'd still be looking in terms of income of class distribution. And then I'd be coming out and saying we want stuff that makes the majority better off, which is the workers. Or the non-capital owners, because ultimately I don't think workers will be a sensible category either if we manage to survive climate change. So yeah, you've got to have an interest. You've got to have a political element to your ideology, and it should be one which is pro the majority of the population. If economics is not there for the mass of humanity, what's it there for? And now, if it's not there for the mass of life on the planet, what is it there for?
And I see one final question in the Q&A.
I've noticed Peter Turchin being I very much like Peter Turchin's approach to history, by the way. I differ in some of his empirical trends, but I think he's giving a much better guide to history than mainstream economists gives to economics. The other question, Doncho, sorry. Yeah.
I think Rory asked one first and I accidentally put it to the answer already. So Rory is asking, do you have any thoughts on Peter Turchin's theories?
Oh yeah, no, Peter Turchin's work, Peter Turchin does very similar mathematics to me. I actually wanted to use my software package to do his mathematics in future. But he's focused on government debt, for example, and if you look at the long stream of human history, going back 5,000 years, where you are looking at political conflict between different societies, and in that world, gold and so on become vital because you're paying your mercenaries in gold because you can't be sure you're going to win the next battle. So in that case, the level of government debt is a vital indicator. He's left out private debt. I've just written and said I think you should include private debt in future. You might find it more explanatory now than well, he wouldn't have looked at the data beforehand. So his methodology I quite like. A couple of his elements of what he selected I disagree with. But I think overall, yes, very, very good work and well worth promoting.
Okay. And I think that's all that we have time for now, just so we can move the program on smoothly.
Yep.
Thank you so much, Professor Key, for your contribution. It's been incredibly insightful and incredibly important as well, as we are aiming to come out with fresh ideas out of this crisis. So thank you again for joining us, all the way from Thailand, given the quite large time difference. And we hope you have a nice rest of your day. And I will pass over to Pauline to introduce our next keynote.
Thank you. Okay, I'll end my recording and I'll send you